Good afternoon. It is THCB Gang for May the 6th, 2021. Today we don't have a special guest. We're not talking about anybody's books, so we can now get into the real nitty-gritty of what's going on. I have a great lineup, 6 of my favorites today. The two health futurists both put first, as was pointed out to me by Kim Bellard, who was kind of down the bottom, with the writers down the bottom of the list, but Jeff Goldsmith and Ian Morrison, not Jeff Morrison and Ian Goldsmith, they're different folks. Deven McGraw, bureaucrat, regulator, lawyer, and now Chief Regulatory Officer at Citizen, will be telling us a little bit about what they've been up to this week. Rosemarie, CEO of Day Health Strategies, and then Kim Bellard and Mike Magee, both regular writers on THCB. And we are going to go live. So hi, everyone. Hope everyone is having a good time and enjoying themselves. So let's just go around the horn and tell me what you've been noticing in the last week or two. So I'll start with you, Ian.
Big noticing yesterday, Chelsea in the final, and congratulations, Matthew. Are you going to Istanbul? Because if you are, Jeff and I have some bar suggestions for you.
I literally was just, my dad has had some health issues, and I may have to be heading over there to see him. I was wondering, can he hang on for 3 weeks so I can go via Istanbul? We'll see. But yes, those who didn't follow, Chelsea got to the Champions League final, won the semi-final against Real Madrid yesterday, and I may have been a little bit distracted in the middle of the day. If you see my health in 2.0 with Just a Massey, you'll notice quite a bit of that going on.
Yeah.
Rosemary, what have you been up to?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Ian, I forgot. Yes, do you have a serious thing to say? We just want to talk about.
Well, no, just
fast enough, Ian.
But one of the things I think we'd like to talk about, and it's just personal, really, is when is it safe to go abroad and where? I have real life examples given family members we could get into, but I think just given the case rates around the world, that's an interesting question. This group might be able to help me with.
And I can comment a bit on what I found out about the English vaccine program in the last day or two. Sorry, yeah. Rosemary, now it's your turn.
Well, on the first hand, sticking a little closer to home, I think the question of interstate travel is going to be an interesting one. The Massachusetts and New England are doing very well where I reside in our vaccine rates, and so the question is if we could close our borders, reach herd immunity, and to heck with everybody else, I guess, which of course wouldn't please our tourism industry, but it does pose another one of those kind of interesting interstate questions and how we're all gonna travel and treat each other. So that's on my radar. Far further away, of course, is what's going on in India and the tragedy there, and there's a lot of fundraising efforts in my neck of the woods to get some of those oxygen that aren't high-tech equipment but can keep people who aren't quite in as critical a condition out of the hospital and surviving. So there's a big push, and I think we should support that. And last but not least, the hearing today, I wasn't able to watch it, but on Black maternal mortality is a topic that I'm thinking a lot about, and I'm working on a piece related to Mother's Day on that. So I'm glad it's getting the attention that it deserves, and we've got to do better.
You'll talk a bit more about that. Mike, what have you been noticing?
Well, yesterday I did a presentation about the U.S. healthcare system and the Constitution, this issue of right versus privilege, which involved a lot of constitutional law, but it also involved current events. And one of the things we charted as part of that presentation was the number of minutes that President Biden spent on the aisle with Bernie after his address to Congress, which was quite a few. And the reason we were charting that is because the exact words that he used when he said, Democrats and Republicans, let's get on with this. This is gotta be a right, not a privilege. The actual words there were Bernie's words, word for word from 2009. So as we've discussed here before, my bias is that Biden is set to do something large and we'll just have to wait and see.
Looking forward to seeing Jeff disagree with that, but Kim.
Well, Rosemarie touched upon the India thing, so I want to go back over that. We can talk about it later. So I'm interested in this move to strip out the intellectual property protection for the vaccines. On the one hand, I understand the drive for it. On the other hand, I'm not sure it's going to be the magic wand that people think it's going to be. Stat News reported today that Moderna gave away their IP last October, and to date, nobody else has taken them up on it. So there's a far cry between getting the intellectual property and actually manufacturing doses from it. And I think a lot of people are pushing for it are not really recognizing that.
Fantastic. Deven.
Yeah, so today is the day, the deadline for submitting comments to the federal government on some changes to the HIPAA privacy rule. That agency does not change that rule very often, but they put some proposals out. This was actually one of the rules that got published in the wee waning hours, literally, of the Trump administration. That does make some improvements or propose some improvements in the right of individuals to access their data, but also makes some changes around, whether information can be, when information is shared with health plans, whether it's subject to the minimum necessary rules, which basically is about, can a health plan get your entire record if that's what they need or say they need for certain purposes. And then also some clarifications around sharing with friends and family, which an issue which really came to a head during the opioid crisis in terms of hospitals and doctors not feeling as free to share with family members about what might be going on with their loved ones with respect to opioid dependency and risks and overdoses, et cetera.
Well, that's pretty interesting stuff, and I'm also going to come back to it in a bit.
Are you sure? I'm probably the only person that finds it interesting, but I'm glad to hear that you do.
I'm still pushing. I've been an interoperability nerd ever since I met you, if not before, Deven.
That's true.
But
very true.
I'm also going to ask you before you go away. Yeah, as you're the sole, it's not that usual that you're the only person here working in directly a digital health company. You guys bought somebody this week, so tell me who says them bought and what it did and why I don't get a beer out of it.
But you don't get a beer out of it, right? It is not Stella the beer. Sadly, we did not buy Stella the beer company. Don't think they're for sale. And I think they're part of a bigger beer company, which would have been very expensive for a little startup. No, we purchased not actually a whole company, but some software that provides data quality analytics and interoperability services for health information exchanges, the regional and statewide entities that exchange information, usually on behalf of doctors and hospitals. And, we also do a lot to improve the quality of data that we get for our users. So we're sort of squarely in the space of improving data quality, but now it's both for HIEs and also for patient managed exchange. And then we also will be helping our HIE customers meet their obligations under the information blocking rules, particularly with respect to sharing data with patients.
So other than giving yourself more work, personally, it sounds like in that last part, is the goal here that you think that, Citizen will be a better front door for patients to access the records for information exchanges, as well as, the work you've been doing over time, getting directly to providers?
Yes, and but we also think that the work that we have done on data quality standardization, data quality improvement can actually be leveraged by HIEs as well. So yes, in terms of being the digital front door, absolutely. But also we think there's a lot of synergy to the work that we have done to improve data quality so that patients can share it, and the work that HIEs do to improve data quality generally for their traditional customers, which have typically been healthcare providers and health plans.
Yeah, and last week we had Shantanu Nundy on the show. None of you were on it, but he's the CMO of Accolade. He wrote a book about care after COVID, and he was pretty gung-ho about all this interoperability stuff going to work, and it'll enable these new care organizations and all the kind of good stuff we talked about. It was like a very optimistic version of me and Jessica being on the show, if you can imagine that, which I thought was interesting. But there was the point that as some of these organizations get bigger, you're still going to have the silo between the big organizations starting to take care of care of different aspects of people, and all the stuff you're doing there seems to be heading in the right direction. We'll still see how it goes, but I think it's yes, it's nerdy, yes, it's tricky, but I think it's pretty important.
Well, I mean, but who has a better interest in breaking down the silos than the patient, right? Like for the patient to have the right to get their data from all the places where it's been I'm not suggesting that it replaces all interoperability within the healthcare system, but I think people have undervalued the role that patients can play in moving data around to where it needs to go.
Right. All right, Jeff, what have you been up to, paying attention to?
I'm just baffled by the premature victory dance that we're all having as a society about our conquering COVID. Yesterday, 45,000 cases and 800 deaths. And that against a background of a dramatic reduction in the number of tests, which suggests to me that 45,000 number is nowhere close to the real number. So I'm still like back on we haven't whipped this thing yet. And, at Rosemarie's point, I've got a trip scheduled to Montana at the end of June to address the Montana Hospital Association. Well, Montana is on one tail of that, celebrate the end of COVID spectrum. They're not going to have they're not going to be halfway to herd immunity. So I guess I just sort of don't breathe for 24 hours and hope for the best.
Maybe true.
On Mike's point, honest to God, we had a $658 billion federal deficit in March. And the first half of fiscal 21, $1.75 trillion. So for someone as I am, who's on record as wanting to drop the Medicare eligibility age to 50, I really believe that. I think there's going to be a very, very soon to happen hard stop on our ability to continue printing money and passing the cost of all of this restarting onto our grandchildren. I just don't think it's responsible fiscal policy.
All right, let's come to that one in a second. Let's start with let's go around start with the whole COVID vaccination. What happens next? And there's two things that just happened to me personally this week that I thought would be. I had my second shot last week, and my wife is getting her second shot today. A couple of things I found out. One is, as I mentioned briefly, my dad's had some health issues in the UK, and I didn't realize this, but the UK has gone, although they've done very well in vaccinations with the AstraZeneca one, they've actually still, my sister who's in her 40s has just got her first shot literally today, and they're delaying the second shots for a long time, which I guess is not in the protocol. But I mean, her next shot is going to be in July, so we're talking about a 2-month gap between shots rather than the sort of 3 weeks between the two here. And the other thing which was relevant to this is that I talked to my house cleaner yesterday. When I say I talked to my house cleaner, my au pair girl is from Colombia and speaks Spanish. My house cleaner doesn't speak great English. I speak no Spanish because I'm an incompetent, foolish English-American person with no language skills. And but I was talking to her about whether she was in the queue, and she told me that she'd read on Facebook that the vaccine was killing people and didn't work.
Tucker.
So I spent so this quick conversation and then ended up with me spending half an hour explaining that I worked in healthcare, kind of semi-line that I was a doctor, but not quite, but explaining that I worked with a lot of very important doctors and I knew that I had all the data and, trying to be my earnest best self saying, here's what the real data is, here's the real issue, and here's why it's important for you. And, and literally the first time ever being one of the people trying to meet somebody who was just being given wrong information and trying to appeal to her kids and her family and whatever else, right? So by the end of the conversation, she told my translator that she would be reconsidering, and hopefully that'll change. But I wonder how many more conversations like that, hopefully done by somebody with more skill and empathy and better language skills than me, need to be done, and whether we can start shifting the needle. It does seem to me that in the data I saw from Kaiser Family Foundation, the reluctance to have a vaccine seems to be going down across the board, but it's still pretty strong amongst white evangelicals, which are, I guess
Republicans.
And Republicans, right?
Well, apparently last night Tucker did a piece about all these unreported deaths due to the COVID vaccine, And someone took him on Twitter and said, the same people that thought that COVID deaths were overreported believe that the COVID deaths of the vaccine are underreported. So,
I mean, I understand that, but we have this, we have multiple misinformation channels, right? So Fox News, there's a lot of Spanish stuff, Spanish language stuff on Facebook. Clearly, that has come across. There are probably a bunch of other channels, and I know there's a big debate yesterday about whether Trump should be allowed back on Facebook and whether he's going to start his own social media channel, what have you. But I mean, N of one. This is what I was told yesterday, and I mean, Jeff has talked about this a lot, and as has Mike. So the lack of authority and the lack of belief in science has been, is serious. So, having said that, who wants to, Mike, weigh in on that, and then weigh in on what we're going to do about Jeff's problem of us not getting the herd immunity.
I did have a question for Jeff, but before that, this problem with the truth is not a new problem for this country. This has been the original sin from the very beginning, from our first creation, that you could take these 13 states and bring them together and say that there would be a supreme law and a national government, but you 13 states can do what you damn well please. That lie, combined with the lie that we had some individuals that were only 3/5 of an individual, that sort of set the tone for a country that can't deal with the truth, never has been able to deal with the truth. So what Trump tapped into wasn't a new phenomenon. It's just been amplified by the social media that allows it to, go nuclear. The question I had for Jeff was, doesn't this issue of, you get up to 1/5 or so of the gross national product that's dedicated to this venture, and you've got it all locked down with the various different collusive elements and sectors and guilds that are running this whole show. Doesn't this financial disaster play both ways? I mean, on the one hand, it's an argument not to spend more, but on the other hand, isn't it an argument to do something fairly radical that will seize back control over both cost and quality? I mean, couldn't you use this as an argument to say, screw it, you guys don't want to cooperate, we're just going to expand Medicare? Why wouldn't that make sense?
Well, I think the problem is, where do you put the limited amount of incremental dollars that we can invest in our society and have the best gain in social benefit? Is it expanding private health insurance coverage or public health insurance coverage to the 30 million people that don't have it? Or is it really having an effective public health system? Or is it having a caregiving structure that enables people to work and to not have to be poor because there's no one to take care of their kids or their older people? That's the conversation we're not having. And so the argument that, I mean, independent of that, the idea that we nationalize the health system, we have, take control over the economics of the healthcare system, presumes that we're competent to actually manage that healthcare system. A great deal of contra evidence to which proposition we can see in the last 12 months.
All right. So two things. I want to say real quickly about this, but I want to get back to the vaccine and come back to this one later. So no more jumping the gun, YouTube. But there was an interesting report, I think it was Kaiser Family Foundation, who pointed out that if you reduce the age of Medicare, the private health, and Ian's banged away on this point for years, but certainly in this show, that the private health, the America's non-profit hospitals depend on high utilization and high prices from that commercial population age between 55 and 65. So if you put them into Medicare, you're actually going to be really, really changing the game for those hospitals. You might conceivably reduce cost overall if you could do that.
We actually simulated the effect of a bunch of these different scenarios on a sort of semi-typical $1.4 billion nonprofit health system. And there was only one scenario that didn't devastate their operating margins. And that was what we called a leak-proof reduction in the age of Medicare eligibility. So that if you could figure out a way to prevent employers from dumping their 50 plus workers into Medicare, it was almost a wash.
Right.
I mean, it was a point reduction in the bottom line. If it leaked a 5 to 7 point reduction, a 5 to 7 point operating loss. So we actually simulated the effect of Medicare for All of two different versions of Medicare after the age of 50, and Matthew's absolutely dead on right. I mean, our hospital system is addicted to those private insurance margins, and any shrinkage of the private insured population in a whole bunch of institutions, particularly rural institutions, end up on the rocks. We tried to estimate how much you'd have to increase Medicare payment across the board in order to offset that effect, and it was more than a 20% bump in the rates, taking away a lot of savings.
Did you simulate what would happen if you did that with Medicare lowering the age, but then bumped up the Medicaid rates to some more reasonable level?
No, we didn't get a chance to do that. Medicaid is not the problem, guys. I mean, I don't know how many people appreciate hospitals lose 3 times as much money taking care of Medicare patients now as they do taking care of Medicaid patients. That's AHA data. We were shocked. The Medicare losses escalated dramatically after the Affordable Care Act, which took a big chunk out to pay for the coverage expansion. And another big chunk came out with the 2012 sequester, which put in a permanent 2% per year reduction in the updates. Medicare is a much more significant financial problem for hospitals than Medicaid is.
I had an interesting chat with Noel Brennan, who runs the Healthcare Cost Institute,
Right.
in which he basically said he didn't believe them. And I said, "You're a cantankerous, difficult Irishman."
I'm
So he
sorry.
basically didn't believe the hospitals couldn't make money on Medicare. And,
Look at the numbers. Well, we looked at that too. And, because our argument was, consultants want to help you be more efficient. Somebody's making money under Medicare. Well, who is it? Well, it turns out that people making money under Medicare are people that get a lot of supplemental payments, direct medical education, indirect medical education, and DISH. That's the key. That and having a really fat local wage index. Not efficiency, but essentially all the little subsidies that were built in when prospective payment was put in the 80s.
So it's the price is stupid. Uwe was right. All right, let's go back to the.
It's not prices. It's where you sit. in
Additional payments. Right?
The
Supplementary price
under Medicare.
All right. Anyway, Rosemarie, you're on mute. I want to quickly go back to Ian's initial topic, and then get into this issue that you raised, Rosemarie, and Ian raised about how we're going to deal with the vaccine, how we deal with travel, whether it's local, regional, and then if there's going to be any impact, because they're about to impact on herd immunity. They're about to give Pfizer the green light to go for 12 to 16-year-olds, and there are clinical trials now for kids. And part of the issue with herd immunity has been, there are only so many adults compared to kids, so you have to get to a much bigger chunk of adults. I wonder if we can get there with kids, and what your impression is that we're going to do with travel. So, Ian, why don't you jump on the travel issue?
Well, I mean, as I said, I'm going to Hawaii on Saturday, right? To my wife and I to meet up with our daughter and her husband, and we had our little test. The only place you have to get a test within 72 hours, and it has to be at you drive up to the airport. We were the only car there, even though we had to get this appointment. It's color. So I guess color actually has some revenue, at least a couple $100 from us. They turned it around beautifully. And then you have to have an account with the state of Hawaii, which you've got to create. And then you can load the thing up on a PDF, but you have to go back in again within 12 hours to do the attestation. And then if you don't want to be hassled on the other end, you have to enroll in this other subsequent thing, which turns out is like Bert and Ernie's medical group in Hawaii, where you're uploading your passport and everything else. And my wife's going, "Are you seriously doing this?" And I'm still only halfway through it. Now that's just to go to a safe island, which has had a very low outbreak. How the hell are we going to get to Europe, India? And my acid test is, when is it safe to fly through Heathrow, given all this stuff? And I'm on the books to go to Scotland and France in September, but France's rate I checked today is 30 cases per 100,000. It's 10 times the UK, and it's 20 times California.
But so the thing that surprised me about Hawaii, because my paragoda keeps on showing up in this episode, she went to Hawaii and she had to get the test. She'd already been vaccinated, and I was going,
yeah.
So I'm going, why doesn't the vaccine passport count? Apparently Hawaii said it hasn't, and they've done very well, and they're all open. I mean, it's great in Hawaii once you get there, if you get there in. It reminds me of your story of buying health insurance from the beach in Mexico, which is a great article. We won't go into it.
Oh yeah.
When you became a farmer. I'll just leave that one out.
I
there.
joined the Farm Bureau.
Google Ian Morrison farmer. It's a great article.
Yeah.
But I guess that the question is, and I'd love to hear more from you, Deven, and more from you, Rosemarie, about where you think we're heading with this, because we talked a bit about vaccine passports last week and the legality of this, but on a practical measure, I mean, how do you manage people are flying around, and who knows, right?
Well, my wife's best friend from Vermont, from Stowe, Vermont, who now lives in Montreal, has spent 14 or 15 months basically stuck in Montreal, flew down to Vermont to get vaccinated, and then flew back to Montreal to be locked in a room for 2 weeks. And only 3% of the Canadian population has been vaccinated. 3%. So, I mean, Canada did a pretty impressive job of putting the stopper in this, and we're nowhere close to being able to cross this border.
Yeah, just on that footnote, on that, my wife talked to her cousin who lives in Lake of the Woods in Ontario this morning, and they're on lockdown. I got family in BC, and they're not allowed to travel between provinces. They can't leave their health district still.
And actually, the one other thing that worried the hell out of me is that the most vaccinated place on Earth. Does anyone know what that is, by the way?
Israel.
No, it's not. It's the Seychelles.
Seychelles, yeah.
Over 60% vaccinated, and they've gone on lockdown. I don't know if it's tourists coming in and spread it or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess the question is, I mean, when I've been reading my Bob Wachter and others, tweets, it looks like that there's the vaccine is kind of killing the surge, but there's a surge amongst people who aren't vaccinated, and there's a big question when you look at what's happening in Brazil and obviously in India as to whether we're going to end up with a significant minority, and worse, maybe that we get enough variants in that minority where there is that it spreads to younger people and people less likely to be vaccinated and all the rest of it. So it's worrying me. But I guess that my question is, and we talked a bit about this a couple of weeks ago when you were on, Deven, but from a sort of legal point of view, when we're talking about Biden saying we're going to open up on July the 4th. The Brits are starting to open up at the end of May. They're going to let people back in soccer stadiums for the European Championship and stuff like that. I mean, what do we think this is going to look like?
I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know that any of us does, but I can say, we have to remember the vaccines are incredibly effective, but they're not 100% effective, right? So there still are some cases where people have been vaccinated and have come down with COVID-19. They benefit from the vaccine's protections and usually don't get nearly as sick. And so far, nobody has died who's been vaccinated. So that's the benefit of vaccination. I think, and islands in particular have to be super careful. I'm getting a different set of instructions, Ian. I'm supposed to go to Hawaii next week too. I'm like, I don't have to do all those things Ian has to do. Why is he having to do all those things? I have to have the positive test, but once I have the positive test, I don't have to quarantine. And the vaccine card means I don't have to quarantine when I reach the island. But maybe that's because I'm going to Maui and you're going to a different island. But But obviously islands have to be more careful, and because islands do have that sort of natural barrier that other states and countries don't enjoy. So I think the idea is that we can open up to, we probably would be wise to do this episodically to countries with high vaccination levels, because the chances of and also, you know, some proof of vaccination would be helpful, although that brings up a whole morass in and of itself, which we've talked about. But the idea is to, the more people that are vaccinated, the more protected the population is, but it doesn't mean zero risk. But when you open up, you obviously want to be careful that you're sort of opening up to people that are not going to sort of introduce more unvaccinated people into your population, because then you spike more, you know, that you'll have spikes in cases.
I think there are a couple of key things here. One is our friend, the mask, is going to be an accoutrement that we will be living with for some time to come. And you're just going to want to keep one handy. And that's always, at a minimum, it's an individual choice and how you're gauging risk. And I think there will still be venues that may require, you know, independent of whatever government does, there will be choices that have to be made, you know, even when we're supposedly safe, given the potential surge of variants and things we just can't control. The mask is the simplest tool that we have. So I do think that, you know, we're not going to be like burning them or throwing them away anytime soon. The second thing is just the booster shot phenomenon. And I saw some good news on the Moderna one. So I think, you know, we're going to just need to keep in the flow of getting shots. And that's part of how we'll manage this. In terms of the travel, I think we're going to have to pick our spots carefully. And I've been talking with folks who are kind of saying, I wanted to go to Europe, but I think I may want to stay a little safer this year until we get a real handle, at least not until fall. And we see how they're doing, because the stats aren't good and that they're not enjoying the same supply of vaccines that we've got. So yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about, and I know you raised this, Kim, already, what our sense is, I mean, and now, you know, with the release of what our sense is around sort of vaccines for good for the world, right? Because I think we've now all realized, and obviously we not only have the tragic situation we're seeing in Brazil and India and elsewhere, but also we're kind of realizing that we're stuck here in America, and that isn't great for both, you know, travel and leisure, but also business, you know, if we can't figure out ways to push this around. Like I said, in the UK, they've been delaying the second vaccine for the AstraZeneca thing because of supply issues. But and we see there are these problems. Obviously, Canada, we mentioned, the rest of Europe, but obviously then we've got Asia and the developing
Africa.
Yeah,
Africa,
I mean,
of course. So Kim, you were saying that the release of the, you know, other than the stock prices, some of Moderna and some of the others, the change of the patent law, you don't think is that big a deal. But I mean, how do we get, you know, and do we think that within the US government, the WHO, or anywhere else, we've got kind of an engine coming that's going to do kind of what happened in the US globally? Is that happening, or are we going to rely on the munificence of Vladimir Putin to get the Sputnik vaccine to everyone?
Well, the drug companies that are manufacturing the vaccine are saying that they're going to ramp up their production. The question is how much that's going to be. And, you know, you always got to take that stuff with a grain of salt. I am worried that, you know, we have an example, you know, when J&J outsourced that manufacturing to that Baltimore company, that did not go well. So I do not think having a bunch of third world vaccine companies, you know, take this intellectual property and try to replicate things is necessarily going to be a good thing. I haven't followed the story closely enough, but, you know, my understanding is India is one of the leading pharmaceutical manufacturers in the world. And so I do not understand why those manufacturers are not now manufacturing vaccines.
good question. Lack of government leadership, perhaps?
Well, I mean, India has its very Trumpist leader, right? Modi is.
They're a bit for the grace of God.
And they were doing, and again, they were doing fine for a long time compared to many other countries. And then all of a sudden,
and Modi is getting his butt kicked right now, and I think deservedly so, for taking a victory lap on the first, 10 or 11 months of this pandemic and being completely unprepared for what's.
Well, and again, I haven't drilled down it, but is India in a bimodal situation where the middle and upper classes are doing pretty good in terms of being vaccinated? And again, it's usual. It's the lower, the less well-off people that are taking the hit.
I believe they're still well below 10% on the overall vaccination numbers. I mean, I
Okay.
think once you get out, of the UK, the US, Israel, and the Seychelles and Bhutan, the two with us, I think there are very few countries which are really, have done the aggressive thing that we've done. And it strikes me that this is an area where, it's a world war, which hopefully we're on the same side. And that, there are clearly things that we can do. But if it's going to be 2023, 24, 25 before we have, the majority of the world vaccinated against this thing, we're kind of be in the same mess that we're in. And then that does relate back to Jeff and Mike's point, is how much more can we keep the printing press going to keep the economy going if we can't have the world economy as we understand it? We know that we have supply shortages of semiconductors impacting automobile manufacturers, and the price of lumber going up and housing going up because
the koozies,
up and down the road. So there's a lot of bad stuff going on because the world we were used to still isn't back to anything like normal.
Well, but the problem with the scenario that you just outlined, Matthew, is you have a couple billion person pool in which this virus can mutate. That's
Absolutely.
the big problem here, is that you've just got, you've got a tiny portion of the total world population that's protected from this natural evolutionary process. And
the University of Washington just put out a study today that said that COVID deaths worldwide are twice the number that is the acknowledged official numbers, and even in the U.S. it's 40% higher. So it's we know it's bad, and apparently it's much worse than the numbers are actually showing. So
I think, though, one of the challenges will be to try to predict what is going to be the lasting effect of some of these things that are intersecting right now. Beyond whether we can travel and when we can do this, have we seen things that are going to, in a cultural way, change the rules in the future? I'd be curious what Ian and Jeff think about the fact that not only do we have the pandemic, which emphasized the vulnerability of a science entrepreneur driven healthcare system where you try to combat disease and make believe that that's health. That's sort of been revealed for its weaknesses through the pandemic, in that we had no plan and we don't have the ability to coordinate resources across our entire nation. Then we have this woke movement, which is really about waking up to the truth. Can you admit the weaknesses in a society that has been self-governing some of its people and abusing others? And then lastly, you've got these autocratic movements which came to a head in this country on January 6th. And the fact that a sizable portion of our population not only refuses to acknowledge the truth, but would like to continue to abuse those who've been abused historically. So, my question with the pandemic isn't so much when that will end, it's what's going to be left behind. What are we going to look like as a self-governing nation 2 years, 4 years from now?
Rosemarie, do you want to jump in on that? That's kind of I think it's an open goal for you, given what you've been writing and talking about. So say a few things.
Oh, wow. I was thinking about, there's so many elements here, including just, can we afford this? And I was trying to think of some of the things I've heard economists say, and you kind of go back to, we can't afford not to, but we're in such a different boat. And the US being, wealthiest country, our set of considerations in some ways is different than what it is for the rest of the world. And yet we are so incredibly affected by what's happening in the rest of the world. I'm thinking of even just all of the businesses that have outsourced to India. And that that's a ripple effect we haven't talked about here, but you think about the call centers, fulfillment, all kinds of things where we're now getting messages that due to the devastating impact of COVID, and it's like, so if people want to kid themselves that we can be protected here in the US, and I think some people still are kidding themselves. It's just not the case. So, very profound questions being asked, and what is frankly the role of a really wealthy nation. And honestly, I was saddened this week on the news of Bill and Melinda Gates impending split, given that I think the Gates Foundation and both of them as leaders have done so much, to try and get us here in the rich US to think about and be ahead of what needs to happen for the rest of the world. And I looked at that as very promising. So just I was so sad and to think, for them as a couple, but also just like, what's that do to the work? It's making a lot of people nervous. Anyway, I don't think I'm really answering Mike's question, but these are the things that were going through my head, as you were talking about.
Well, I mean, I would say that, there's another thing which does come out is that world leadership, right? So Biden is clearly going to be much more so. In fact, there was some data this week about the faith in America as a bastion of democracy. As you might imagine, it was 0 in 2016 through 2020 in like countries like Germany and South Korea. And it's now heading back up under Biden. Part of the issue here is can we do what the World Health Organization did, which was an incredible effort against smallpox back in the 60s and 70s, which was had everybody in the world, including the Americans and the Russians, who were then enemies, working together. And just recently, there was more news out of Oxford that there's a pretty effective malaria vaccine, which some of the Gates Foundation, I think, is funded, is now working. And you can imagine, going back to what Jeff was saying about Africa or other developing nations like that, do we have the international cojones and ability and infrastructure to do massive vaccination campaigns? Because we're going to need them for malaria. If that works, we're going to certainly need it for COVID. And I'm hearing some of that, but I have kind of been hearing a bit more of it. I mean, naturally, kind of an America first thing. Well, I'm very surprised how poor some of these governments have been. Some of these, developed world governments like Canada and Germany have been in getting their own stuff done.
Right.
To connect what you just said with what Mike was saying, I mean, the devastation of I'm still devastated by what happened in the Capitol in DC on January 6th. And I continue to be devastated when I see what is happening with certain Republicans who are like trying to perpetuate this big lie. I mean, it literally makes me sick to my stomach. I can't even take in some of the news on some days, to be completely honest, because I just don't. It's surreal on some level. I wish it were surreal. Unfortunately, it's all too real. And so I know that Mike says this has long been our history, but there have been times that we have exerted moral leadership, in the international stage. And I think historians will say what we did in World War II, I mean, frankly, we entered too late, but when we did enter, we went big and we freed people out of concentration camps, and we coasted on some amazing moral leadership for a long time. And I feel like what happened under the Trump era is we lost tremendous ground. And yet I'd hate to be a pessimist. So I was thinking that maybe, just maybe, if Biden could really, get us to a decent place, and I know it varies by state, but just overall, could we really regain some of our moral leadership by helping with this pandemic? And it would be enlightened self-interest. I think a lot of folks could get on board, because we have to help the other parts of the world. We have to. And maybe this could be the war that we fight, better than all the stuff we've been pouring defense industry dollars into. And we do this. And maybe we could even coalesce some. No, I'm getting really hopeful. Coalesce some people in our country who've been divided around. If we can see that, and like I said, enlightened self-interest, it would be the right thing to do.
Well, but that's been the biggest disappointment for me, at least, about watching our country go through this pandemic, because it hasn't been a unifying crisis at all.
The opposite.
It's been a crisis that's deepened the divisions. And my daughter is an MPH in epidemiology, and her very first job out of grad school was to go to the Congo and enlist in the fight against Ebola. And one of the lessons that she learned was that the biggest constraint in that fight was the lack of faith in the Congolese government and in government in general by the people in the eastern part of the country that were literally in chaos and were not being protected by the government from all of these marauding bands of guerrillas. Well, we're not all that far from that here, are we?
But we had the most reprehensible leader for the past 4 years who did so much damage.
Well,
we could have been, I mean, yes, we have divisions,
no
but
doubt
he
about
fanned
it.
the flames. And so we have to give Biden Harris a chance, because I do think they're taking the high road continually and trying to bring us back together. And I'm just saying, like, if we could build some momentum around that and take that show on the road internationally, we could regain some of what we've lost. I know there's still going to be people who believe in the big lie and perpetuate that, but it's not the majority.
Well,
let me give you one data point which suggests that we might have somebody, which is that the Ipsos poll just came out last week, which is compared that we are 65% of Americans feel optimistic about the future of the country. And it was 40, it was under 50, it was like 42% around in 2016. And the last time it was this high was 2006, which of course was immediately before we had a massive housing crash and went into the massive, the great recession of the 2007, 2008. But nonetheless, you know, I think we're getting there. I agree with Rosemarie and Mike that, you know, if you look at what Liz Cheney is going through, and Liz Cheney is not exactly a bleeding heart liberal, by my estimation, what she's going through, because she actually says, no, there wasn't, you know, the election was real and we lost, and, you know, and what she's going through and what the Republican Party, you know, it's still coalescing around Trump, and they're all hanging out with him and still, you know, going out to Mar-a-Lago and kissing the ring. I get it. That's the way it's going to be. But I think the country's, I know we have lots of problems with Electoral College and the Senate and everything else and the way that things work. And I think the country is leaving them behind. Whether that impacts us politically in time to do anything that, you know, Mike thinks that Biden might do, or even for Biden to do what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail, right, which is a public option and lowering the Medicare age down to, is it 55 or 50? I can't remember.
60.
60.
60.
I want to go back to something Jeff said earlier about, you know, health insurance versus other health measures. I sort of think back, those of us who are old enough, remember the 60s, the argument was guns versus butter, you know, the Vietnam War versus social programs. And I think we got the same choice here. Do we do the health insurance approach of just giving people some coverage, or do we do the more longer term public health kind of investments that have a thing? It's kind of like infrastructure. You know, you can give somebody a card right now and they see that and they feel like they've gotten something, but that doesn't mean there's going to be a care available. That doesn't mean it's going to be affordable. Whereas these investments in public health, they may take a generation to pay off, but they're better investments. That we probably can't spend money on both of them. And do we have the courage to make the long-term better investment or not? I don't know.
I think that's a really good point, Kim. If you look back at what happened with nation building post-World War II in Germany and Japan, the focus was on providing universal health care as a first step to nation building, because they believed that without equity, justice, safety, and security on the front end, which is what they were using healthcare for, you could not build democratic institutions that would last. And in some ways, I sort of feel like the chore ahead of us in the US, long overdue, is nation building. You know, we have basically a civil war of ideas going on. Somebody's going to win. And in the outset, we're going to have some ruins. And so then the question is, where and how do you begin to rebuild? And I think probably the answer is the same answer that we used in Germany and Japan. You rebuild with some sort of an approach to health that stabilizes the community and signals that there will be justice for all.
Ian, you're trying to get in.
Well, I agree with the thread of the argument that we should be trying to fix the big problem, but and I'm generally positive, and I think Biden has done a great job of not only handling the domestic situation, but sort of reasserting, you know, American leadership in the form that Rosemarie identified that we historically had. The problem is the fragility of all of that politically, given the slim majorities in the House and Senate and the gerrymandering that will ensue. And, you know, Trump's only a few months away from a campaign to flip the Senate and the House, you know. So he doesn't have a lot of time, and there are these competing pressures. And when Mike posed the important big questions earlier, I was sort of reminded of the Irish joke about you know, that you go up to an Irish farmer and ask him how to get to Donegal, and he said, well, it would be better if you weren't starting from here. You know? And that, I think, is part of our problem that applies to the economic hydraulics of hospitals that we talked about, to the vaccine situation. I just want to make another point, Matthew made, about how bad, I mean, the wavering fortunes of countries and the leaders. You know, Trudeau was a rock star in the early days, and my Canadian family are going mental. I mean, and they're liberals, that he completely mishandled it. The Scots have an election today, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a pretty strong independence vote. But despite the fact that Boris Johnson did a good job with the vaccines, you know, and Nicola Sturgeon was perceived to have done a good job on public health before. So these are countervailing forces going on. It would be wonderful if we could be assured that we don't have any more Donald Trump in our future, and the world could see that. But I'm fearful that he's still going to be an irritant in our side for some considerable time.
On the Trump thing, I mean, you've got the thing that flips me is you've got a lot of countries that had quote unquote sensible, you know, believing government leaders like Trudeau, like Angela Merkel, like Macron, and somehow they have not fit, you know, and the evidence seems to me that from Israel, from here and elsewhere, the only thing you really get done is to vaccinate your population. And they don't seem to have got it. And the fact that they've stopped, the Germans at least, and some other Europeans, stopped the AstraZeneca vaccine, as we did with the J&J one, but at least we had more Moderna and more Pfizer. The fact they stopped that vaccine over what I felt was almost nothing, to me was nuts, because that implied that vaccinations, you know, weren't the answer. And if you look at the data, again, as far as I can tell from my estimations and reading Bob Wachters' tweet stream, it seems to be that, yeah, where we have a surge, it's a surge that's being counted, you know, it's in people who aren't getting vaccinated.
Right.
And that's what we need to get done. Now, yes, there's all kind of problems, like how do you figure out when you're going to Hawaii what the right vaccine, how to show you were vaccinated when you weren't tested. There's a bunch of stuff to be sorted out. But we've got to do that nationally and internationally. And I'm not, I wish I heard more from the Biden administration about, other than this patent thing, about how they're actually going to help figure out and use, you know, in the sort of, we're back to the sort of Mike's post-World War II Marshall Plan in Japan and Germany. How do we figure out how to actually deliver the stuff to the developing world, and to, God knows, if the Germans need it too? How do we get that? How do we get the sort of the vaccine supply chain that seems to have been fixed here, and how do we get it to happen across the world? Because, you know, again, that's moral leadership, but it's also in our self-interest.
But Matthew, there's a non-zero probability that we end up with local herd immunity for the lucky rich people, and a global, you know, range of uncertainty that goes all the way from minor to major. And you know, we have built globalized supply chains that are still you know, vulnerable if that's the scenario that plays out. And
we have US supply chains that are vulnerable because, you know, who picks, I mean, where we live in California, who picks the damn vegetables?
Yeah,
no people coming back and forth from Central America, right? I mean,
well, it's not that countries in the world have been universally unsuccessful in dealing with this. You know, the Chinese got off to a very slow start and let this genie out of the bottle and then basically snuffed it. The Japanese have lost 5,000 people. That's it, in a country of 122 million. The Taiwanese have lost dozens. That's it. Dozens.
That's
right? South Korea's lost about 2,000. So, you know, when you ask yourself, well, what did these countries do? Well, being an island was certainly helpful, and you could shut off travel really fast. But I think two ingredients here made the difference between success and lethal chaos. One was societies that have a residual high level of respect for authority, and two, authorities that were capable of acting decisively and consistently across the society to take measures to prevent this from happening. We flunked both of those tests.
Right.
You know, and while I continue to feel good about what I hear coming out of Washington, except for the who pays for it and where does the money come from thing, it's important to remember that Donald Trump got 8 million more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. Not all of those people were deplorables. Not all of them were yabos. Not all of them were deluded. They really believed that the alternative to Trump was worse. And honest to God, those 73 million people are still with us. It was a fifth of the country. So until we take seriously the fact that, that there was a whole bunch of stuff going on in this society that wasn't working for them and is continuing to not work for them, we're not going to be able to unify. We're going to have to talk to those folks. We're going to have a conversation with the people that thought that Donald Trump was a credible president and listen to them, for God's sake. And maybe we end up doing something different to try and get to that unified place than simply pretending that they'll if we just ignore them, they'll come around.
I agree with you, Jeff, but I think Biden's been giving a good shot at doing that. And today McConnell said what he said in 2010 or 2011 when he said it, which is that my only job is to stop this administration. Same thing he said about Obama, and it kind of worked.
Right.
So I agree
I
with you. I don't know how to get there. Deven.
I actually think that the policies that Biden is putting forth are intended to speak to the disaffected, to the people who sort of feel like government has not been speaking to them.
Yeah.
But it's not. But I think policy wise we're headed on the right trajectory, but the message isn't sinking in, and that's no folks who are going to benefit from these policies don't think Biden's working for them.
Right.
Well,
They want him gone, and they want their guy back in. And it's just,
Right.
we're all thinking about this logically, and it feels like maybe there's something else that has to happen.
There are times in our history where we have just resulted or leaned back on power, where a slim majority has simply said, this is the way it's going to be. I mean, that's how we got into the Civil War. They tried a lot of stuff in the decade or two leading up to the Civil War.
Yep.
And then they finally said, we're going to have a war, and it seems like in many ways we're kind of close to that level of division. If we weren't after January 6th, these people would have backed down. They would have said, okay, we get it. Our guy is a little crazy and let's move on from here. But that's not what has happened. They've doubled down, they've doubled down.
Guys, we had rioting in a huge number of our cities this summer. We had cities that were essentially being controlled by a small band of anarchists.
Yeah.
So, you can take all of the good intentions and all of the, campaign platforms, all the rest of it, and it still doesn't cancel out the fear that people feel that things are spinning out of control and they really don't trust the authorities to protect them. 400 million guns in circulation in the country, 40 million sold last year. What does that tell you about our faith in civil society at this point?
All right. Well, we're at the end of our hour now that Mike and Jeff decided we're going to a dystopian civil war. I think it's time for us to wrap up and
on that positive note,
think about what's happening. All right. So we're going to do a quick go around because Deven has to run. I know in soon the rest of us. We're going to start. Deven, what are you looking for in the next couple of weeks? Who are you guys buying next week?
We're not buying anybody. We're sitting tight. I thought this was such a great conversation. I'm not sure what I could add to it. So,
all right, what are you expecting to happen in the next couple of weeks, irrespective of this conversation? Maybe civil war, maybe not.
No, not civil war. I mean, while I don't disagree that we could be close, I don't think it's going to happen. It'd be very interesting to see. We have a big holiday weekend coming up. It'd be very interesting to see if people travel, what the impact of all of that is. Yeah.
All right. Kim, what are you expecting the next couple of weeks? What do you got your eye on?
But Thomas Friedman wrote a piece in the New York Times yesterday or the day before about Trump first devoured the GOP, now he's after democracy. And I'm looking at, this wacky recount that's going on in Arizona. Florida passed their voting rights bill yesterday. Texas is supposed to vote on theirs today. And I think, and Liz Cheney may be stripped of her assignment for speaking the truth today. So I'm very worried about what's happening with democracy. And the 2022 elections are very scary.
Jeff?
Well, I think Devin's dead on right in what she said, is that Biden's strategy, even though they may not have done a very good job of explaining what it is that they're doing, was designed to try and split the Trump coalition. and to give a whole bunch of people some positive reasons to vote for, a more Democratic Congress in 22 than in 20. But I think what we're going to be seeing in the next 2 weeks is how far Biden gets with his 50 vote non-majority in the Senate. How much of that agenda is he going to be able to slide by, given the base of $3.4 trillion in deficit spending? If he can't raise taxes, not a whole lot of it is going to happen, and I think that's going to depend on a tiny handful of moderate Democrats. So I'm going to be really interested in how that plays out inside Congress in the next couple of weeks.
We'll be looking at the senior senator from your next door state, I think, of West Virginia will be important in that. Ian, what are you looking for the next couple of weeks, rather than other than heading to Hawaii, which is if you get
the Scottish polls just closed, so I'll be curious to see whether I have to get my kilt out and apply for a Scottish passport rather than a British passport.
I'm with you too. Can I get a Scottish
American
passport?
But actually, I'll try and watch the gang when I'm in Hawaii. But I think you should maybe have the digital health crew on and help it interpret what's going on with the stocks, which seem to be in free fall.
Absolutely.
So I'll be watching from afar. Mahalo.
Yeah, I'm watching those too. As my attempt to range trade teledoc hasn't gone very well the last couple of weeks. Mike.
Well, I do have my moments of optimism, and those are because of the fact that we have 4 kids and their spouses. They're all between 40 and 50. We have 10 grandchildren who are coming up to generation, the oldest one being in her junior year of college now. So when I talk to them, they are not nearly as alarmed as I am. They are not worried as much about Facebook or who's taking their data and so on and so forth. So I'm trusting, they're smart people. I'm trusting that they see something that I just can't see, and that they feel that there are solutions to these problems that seem pretty intractable to me. So I'm putting my hope on those generations.
Excellent. And I'll just close to emphasize Ian's point. The digital health publicly traded companies have been having been ramped up amazingly at the start of the year, and now it seems to be in a semi-free fall, as are a lot of the other sort of speculative stocks in clean energy and that kind of stuff and elsewhere. But the overall stock market keeps on grinding ahead with the S&P and the new highs, and the Dow Jones at yet another new high today. And I think there's something to be said for and if you look at the private markets and the venture capital funding, it's still incredible. We've seen $300 million rounds here, there, and everywhere in digital health companies, and a lot in other companies. So in other tech companies. So there is still this question broadly underlying everything else that we have going on today, that are we seeing this kind of change, this technology underpinning change in the economy around things like clean energy and infrastructure and all the other stuff and technology, and is that going to translate to healthcare? And that's still an open question, and we won't get the answer in the next couple of weeks, but we might find my stock trading loss in Teledoc too much to bear. We'll see. All right, one last thing from Rosemarie, and then we're going to go.
Well, when I look ahead for the next 2 weeks, we're coming up on the, I hate to call it anniversary, but it is the 1-year mark of the murder of George Floyd. And I know in a couple of weeks ago when we were on the gang, there was some deep concern about what would happen with the jury trial and how that went. And I have to say, it's a sort of backwards way to say this gives me hope, but we were very fearful about that, and it didn't go the way we feared. And so that doesn't mean now everything is sun and roses. It's not. But to Mike's point, I think sometimes younger people are seeing that perhaps we are having more of a reckoning, and I don't want to say necessarily progress, but this kind of the fact that you have a president, an old white male president, talking about structural racism very directly to people, I find to be a reason for hope, because I think it will help us move down the path of addressing some of our worst sins. And so that's where I'm looking for not just the next 2 weeks, but beyond, but particularly because of this notable date coming up.
That's the THCB Gang wrapping for May the 6th, 2021. We'll be back at the same time, same place next week. Thursday, which is going to be at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And again, I want to thank my guests for today, Jeff Goldsmith from Virginia, Ian Morrison, Hawaii bound, and Deven McGraw, both Hawaii bound, both from California. Rosemarie Day from Boston, Kim Bellard from the Keeping the Midwest, represented from Cincinnati, and Mike Magee from over there in Connecticut. That's your THCB gang for today. I want to thank all my guests. I want to thank everyone for listening either live or on the podcast. And I look forward to talking with everybody and seeing you on the blog next